Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second annual Weather Forecast Office Guam's Regional Climate Conference. Just before we get started with the actual celebrities of this, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping items. So this is going to be recorded. There is the Privacy Act statement attached in the handout section if you'd like to go over that. If you do not wish to be, if you do not wish to have your voice recorded or your video, please do not turn on your camera or your microphone, and you can always ask questions through the question box and we can read them without using any PII. And to ask questions, when we get to the question and answer sections, you have two options, either using that question, using the question box throughout the GoToWebinar handout, or GoToWebinar thing, the word's not coming to me right now. Or you can always use, there's a raised hand feature, and during the question and answer section, I'll be able to unmute you and you'll be able to answer your question through either your computer audio or if you're on phone, through your phone audio. And with that, I will now pass it over to Landon.
All right, thank you very much, Leanne, and thank you all for joining us today. This is our second annual regional climate conference here from WFO Guam. It's something that we started last year as a way to really reach out to all the weather and emergency manager partners across the Western North Pacific. We wanted to bridge the gap, the distances that expand across our region. In this day and age of virtual communications and meetings, we wanted this event to be a way that we can facilitate conversation on all things weather and climate specific to our islands in this region. And so, yeah, last year was a great success. We want to follow along with that tradition and hopefully continue this as an annual event to really talk about topics of interest to our region, like sea level rise, food security, tropical cyclones, preparedness. And so the topics that we're going to be discussing today in this webinar are focused on conversations that I've had with many of us across the region following the King Tide inundation event back in December, then also follow-on discussions with tropical cyclones, climate, what are the projections for the region, what can we expect, how do we better prepare and reduce our risk to these vulnerabilities and these disasters. So we have a great lineup of speakers today, and I will turn this over to my boss, meteorologist in charge, Jenny Miller, for some opening remarks. We do have another set of opening remarks from Palau, but I think they are having technical difficulties. So if they do not join us very shortly, we'll get right on into our presentations. And hopefully Palau will join us once they get through some technical issues. So I'm going to hand this over to Genevieve Miller and take this call right quick. That is from Palau, actually. So Jenny, thank you for your time.
Jenny, you're on mute.
Thank you, Landon. I was just saying that we seem to have the same kind of comments this morning, but to everybody, buenas and hapade. As Landon said, my name is Genevieve Cruz Miller, meteorologist in charge here at the WFO Guam. And to our distinguished guests and ever reliable partners here with us, welcome to the second Regional Climate Conference hosted by the National Weather Service Pacific Region. We are so grateful to have all of you here today with us. And as Landon also mentioned, it wasn't too long ago when a lot of those sidebar conversations at the PIAC monthly meetings and the PICOF, led to the collaboration of hosting such an event like this for all of our users here in Micronesia. And as a reminder, last year was our first conference, and that garnered a lot of interest and got a lot of networking going. When we first started the climate conference, the vision was to provide a weather and climate forum focused on the Western North Pacific, with the goal of bringing together the meteorologists and the staff members of the WFO Guam and the Weather Service offices in Micronesia and the National Weather Service Pacific Region. We also wanted to include emergency managers and government partners and stakeholders across Guam, the CNMI, the Republic of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and including the US Embassies, FEMA, USAID, and regional NGOs. Now we see how important it is for us to continue this momentum as we discuss the climate in our region, how it affects us, how we can make ourselves less vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, and to share all that knowledge and experience amongst all of us. We are fortunate to have the presenters from the University of Hawaii, US Geological Survey, Catholic Relief Services, UHC Grant, USAID Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, and the National Weather Service Forecast Office, Guam. We hope that you will take home some important lessons or information from these presenters and share it with your local governments, your local partners, and the decision makers. And once again, thank you for being a part of the second Regional Climate Conference. And I look forward to the progress that will be made today and beyond. Now I pass it over to Landon.
All right, thank you very much, Genevieve. Unfortunately, the ambassador to Palau is unable to join us at the moment. They are still working their technical difficulties on that end. So what I want to do is go into our first set of speakers. This is going to be the big topic that was resonating across the region through much of December, January, February with the king tide inundation events that were affecting many islands and atolls of the FSM. So there's a lot of flooding across many islands back then. And so this has just been a very popular topic. We're going to be featuring Heather Kerkering, Brad Romine, and John Marra, all to talk about what's been observed, what are the impacts and the projections as we move forward. A lot of people have questions regarding planning, infrastructure, the port. How do you plan for this type of stuff? How much are sea levels going to be rising in the future? So I'm going to pass this over to them. John Marra will talk first, followed by Brad, and then Heather. Please write down your questions or put them in the chat. We'll have a few moments after these presentations conclude for some question and answer, and then we're going to have a bigger block of discussion and question and answer following the whole wrap up, the conclusion of these presentations. So we definitely want the discussion because I think that's where we as a region will definitely learn the most from these discussions. So John, I will pass it over to you.
Great, thanks. Aloha, hafa day, everybody. So I'm John Marra. I'm with NOAA NESDIS National Centers for Environmental Information based in Honolulu. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you guys today. A little bit about sea level rise, focusing on observations and projections. Next slide. So global mean sea level. Since 1993, which is really the beginning of the satellite era, the global mean sea level has risen about almost 4 inches. And that's, if you look at the diagram or the plot on the right, that's the black line, that's since satellites. The line going all the way back to the 1880s is the tide from tide gauges. And since that time, it's risen about 8 or 9 inches. The reason sea level has risen is primarily due to the fact that as air warms, the water also warms. That causes it to expand, and so it increases the volume of water in the ocean. And then also with the warming air, you're melting glaciers and ice sheets, which actually adds water to the ocean. So you've got an increased volume as a result of that as well. While current average sits around 3.3, 3.4 millimeters a year, it is accelerating. Next slide. So just like the global mean sea level, regional and local mean sea level in the Pacific has also risen. More so in the Western tropical Pacific on the order of 10 to 15 centimeters, and close to the global mean in the Central tropical Pacific. These variations are due in part to larger scale circulation related to the winds, just the fact that the trade winds are basically piling up water along the western boundaries in the Pacific Basin. But there's a lot of different other variations that affect what the mean sea levels are related to natural climate variability. And then we'll talk about it more, even what it expressions as extremes. It isn't just the sea level trend, and it isn't even the variations of ENSO back and forth, which can be as high as 30 centimeters in places like Guam. So during a La Nina event like we have now, we have besides elevated mean sea level over time, we have an increase of about 30 centimeters. And if it goes El Nino again, that'll drop. And then there's other factors that can add on to that as well, just having to do with whether you have a storm coming across, those sorts of things. So it's how they all add up over time, and that's what you're seeing as an extreme event. Other factors besides the sort of the ocean-related, water-related pieces is the fact that the land can be moving as well. So you can have vertical land motion. Places like Samoa, that's been a big deal, where we look at compared to the global mean, they've had over 30 centimeters of quote-unquote relative sea level rise. So and that's what you're seeing in the picture. There's basically the tide gauge data in the circles, and then the grid is the satellite information, and there's pretty good agreement other than these sort of places where there's some local factors affecting the sea level trend. Next slide. So I think some folks may be aware of the recent NOAA Interagency Sea Level Rise 2022 report that Billy Sweet was the lead author on, that came out. I'm going to just focus on what I think are a couple of the key takeaways in that document. Really, one of the main points is they basically looked at all of the models and observations, and we've been able to narrow down. It almost doesn't matter what projection you're on. In other words, what rate of change you ultimately end up moving on. It can't change quick. There's some bound within it. Can't change that fast over the near term, and so we're able to constrain out to 2050 almost under any scenario how much it can possibly go up, sort of worst case, best case. And that's what it's looking at. It's saying by 2050, you're probably not looking at much more than about 10 or 15 centimeters of sea level rise, maybe a little bit more than that under the worst case scenarios. But that's about all we can expect to occur relative to, I'm talking about 2020 baseline when I say 15 or 20 centimeters. As opposed to the 2000 baseline in the report. So, it's interesting when you compare that to what we just talked about, how much you get in a La Nina year. So you've got potentially more sea level rise during a La Nina than you do over the next 20 or 30 years. So there's not much divergence in those models over the short term. And next slide. Over the long term, it's a different story. So it all depends on what emission scenario we fall under, and there's a lot of uncertainty into that. This table on the right, I think, is really pretty interesting. It frames it rather than the scenarios necessarily like a 2-degree world or 3-degree world. And so let's take kind of a high end of a 3-degree centigrade world. What does that look like for potential sea level rise out to 2100? Well, even in that case, if you take a look at something like a 1 meter by 2100 sea level scenario, there's only a 5% chance under a 3-degree C world that it's actually going to be a meter high by 2100. It's much more likely to be something lower than that. And you look at, for example, the 0.5 meters, it's an 82% chance. So you can kind of look at this and go back and forth a little bit in terms of how warm you think the world is going to get, and how likely the sea level is going to reach that particular height by this 2100 time frame. Now, past 2100, all bets are off. It is going to get high. It's probably going to be at least 2 meters, maybe more like 6 or even 10 meters. But now we're talking about not 2100, 2300 or 2500. So, it's baked in. That's important to remember. No matter, even if we stopped emissions right now, we're on a path to these sorts of numbers. But how far we get is going to depend on what happens over the next 50, 100 years. Next slide. It's my last slide. So 20 centimeters doesn't seem like a lot. That's kind of what's happened, the amount we've had, but it does have dramatic impacts. And that's what you're looking at here on the left is just an average across all the tide gauges in the region over time. How often has the sea level got above an event that would typically happen on average twice a year? And so it's showing that that's actually changed pretty dramatically since the 1980s. In places like Guam, it used to happen twice a year. Now it's happening 22 times a year. Or Majuro, same sort of thing, on the order of 20 times a year. And then the figure on the right, looking at it, saying, okay, the elevation that used to hit once every 100 years on average, what decade is that 100-year return level going to become an event that occurs every year? And you can see, for example, that extra 20 centimeters of sea level rise that we're talking about over that time frame means that by as early as the decade 2040s, under the lowest sea level scenario, you're going to be seeing 100-year return level events occurring on an annual basis. So flood frequency and severity will continue to increase in the future. Thanks.
All right, thank you, John. Brad, I have now made you the presenter.
Great, thank you. 1 second while I just queue up my slides here. Okay, seeing my slides okay?
Yes, they look great.
All right, thank you. All right, hafade, aloha everybody from Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm Brad Romine, coastal geologist and coastal hazard specialist with the University of Hawaii Sea Grant College Program, as well as the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center, or PIDCAST. I'll be describing some of the impacts we are increasingly experiencing related to sea level rise in the Pacific Islands. There are three main types of chronic impacts we're experiencing at an increasing amount with sea level rise. That's passive flooding, wave overwash, and coastal erosion. Sea level rise will also worsen the impacts of less frequent but more extreme events like waves and storm surges from tropical cyclones. This is a map from the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer showing passive flooding risks, that is episodic to permanent high tide inundation with sea level rise around Asan Beach National Historic Park in Guam. The blue areas are affected by direct marine flooding, and the green are low-lying backshore areas at risk of drainage failure and groundwater flooding. The picture at left shows actual flooding that occurs in that area during high tides and high waves. As John pointed out, extreme tides are and will occur more frequently and severely as sea level rises. Passive flooding occurs from direct marine flooding, backflow in drainage systems, and inundation from coastal groundwater that naturally rises and falls with the tides. These types of impacts are occurring more frequently and severely with sea level rise, as we can see in the example at the bottom left showing a long-term water level history since the 1940s at Kwajalein and Marshall Islands. The best bit line shows the trend of long-term sea level rise in that area, and the blue, more squiggly line shows the variability from month to month at that local site and year to year from natural variability, including El Nino and La Nina cycles. Most importantly, the peaks of extreme water level, they're circled in red here, are occurring more frequently and more severely as that underlying mean sea level increases. And the biggest impacts we see are occurring when high water levels combine with a significant wave event or rain event. The second impact we're experiencing with sea level rise is increased wave overwash. This has been modeled for much of Hawaii's coast at various increments of sea level rise. At right is an example of wave runup over the shoreline during a typical highest wave event of the year, plus 3 feet of sea level rise along the west coast of Maui, with the picture at the bottom showing the actual run-up occurring along this stretch of coast in recent years. You can explore this map data for Hawaii at the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Viewer. Last but certainly not least, sea level rise is leading to increasing coastal erosion and land loss on island shores. On the left are examples of coastal erosion on Guam and Saipan. The map at the bottom right shows projected erosion hazards on the north shore of Oahu, modeled by the University of Hawaii Coastal Geology Group using a combination of measured rates of historical shoreline change and a numerical model of beach response to rising water levels. The green line in the map is the present day vegetation line, and the orange and red lines are erosion hazard lines with 1 and 3 feet of sea level rise respectively. At the top right, we see some of the severe erosion occurring in this area, including loss of a home from the sand dune at the stretch of North Shore this winter. The National and Pacific Islands Regional Climate Assessments and Pacific Islands Climate Change Monitor describe how sea level rise will disproportionately affect tropical islands through threats to fresh water and food supply from saltwater intrusion, threats to other critical infrastructure and assets, beach, intertidal, and wetland habitat loss from coastal squeeze. That is, these habitats being squeezed between migrating water lines and land-based infrastructure. The compounding effects of rainfall plus high tide flooding, including impacts on drainage infrastructure. Water quality impacts from wastewater and erosion as groundwater and drainage systems are impacted, as well as resulting impacts to the tourism and visitor economy. As John described, we're already committed to maybe 1/3 of a meter, about 1 foot of sea level rise around mid-century, possibly a meter or more before the end of the century. This will require a whole range of coastal adaptation approaches to be applied in a location appropriate manner. Heather, coming up next, is going to talk about some of the research going on toward developing improved management and adaptation approaches. So with that, thank you, mahalo, for this opportunity to share with you today. At Wright and in the presentation that's shared through the webinar here, I left addresses to a number of tools and resources for more information. Feel free to reach out to me directly following the webinar if I can ever be of any assistance. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Brad. And Heather, I have just changed over and you have presenter ability now.
Okay, can you see my screen?
We're viewing the presenter aid from PowerPoint screen right now.
I don't know why it's going directly to that. Let's see.
So if you, under the play button, you can hit screen and maybe try to switch which screen it's viewing if you have more than one screen.
What? Okay. Sorry, this thing from the GoTo meeting is taking up so much of my screen. Sorry, so where are you saying to go?
So there's a sharing, there's the first tab should say sharing and there's a big play button and then it has the word screen below it with a little down arrow.
Okay.
And you can pick which screen you want to share.
Okay, let's see if it does that. Okay, how about that?
Perfect.
Sorry for that. Hi, I'm Heather Kerkering. I am the science coordinator with the USGS Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center. Thank you, Brad, for leading into my presentation. So I'm here a little bit to talk a little bit about some of the science being developed within USGS and also with the PICASC, which is the acronym for Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is also a consortium with the University of Hawaii, Manoa, Hilo, and the University of Guam. So this is a tool, a total water level and coastal change forecast viewer that is being developed by USGS, specifically with the Pacific Coastal Science Center in Santa Cruz, California. But it's forecast to be used by the National Weather Service forecasting offices and AWIPS for emergency planners. There's a URL at the bottom you can go to access it. It's not yet operating in the region we're focusing on today. The example you see here is from the west coast of Florida, but the goal is to expand it over 3,100 kilometers of the U.S. coral reef line coast, and they're currently validating it on Guam, where they're also looking at and collecting some of the offshore wave information. One of the other things that USGS is forecasting global future wave heights and storm surges. So USGS is one of the first to include the CMIP6 global climate models into those and used to force NOAA Wave Watch 3 wave model and the Deltares GTSM tide and storm surge models. And also for doing that for finer spatial resolution because it better resolves tropical cyclones and the data and the model grid that's being developed will be accessible. So it'll be the world's first consistent CMIP6, ensemble for surges. I don't know why it's doing that, and waves, that can be available to you. So those you can access from the link I put in there earlier, and then we can also be in touch about when some of the data will be available, or connect you with some of the USGS research scientists, specifically Kurt Storr-Lotze in Santa Cruz, California, that is working on some of these projects. Another one that is actually funded by PICASC, that is a collaboration between UC Santa Cruz and USGS, is looking at the impact of climate change and sea level rise and flooding on national parks and wildlife refuges in Hawaii, Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa. So the CMIP6 modeled waves and storms will have 1, 20, and 100-year storms. The resolution for 0, well, you can see all the different scenarios on there. So what that would look like, and here's an examples of sea level rise, but if you include some of those different scenarios, so the present sea level with annual storm information included, the present plus a 20-year storm event, and the present plus a 100-year storm event, and where that would, and how and where that would impact the coast. So that is actually in Guam at one of the war historical parks. Sorry, I don't have that right. A couple other things I wanted to quickly mention aren't really our projects that we have existing or that are ongoing that could be useful in your work. This particular one is complete. Actually, it was characterizing inundation risk for Majuro Atoll with a collaboration again between the researchers and USGS, working with some other folks from Guam. And this provided TBDEM and an inundation exposure assessment for Majuro Atoll. There's a publication that's referenced below, and since I believe these were provided to you in PDF form, or will be, these slides, there's a QR code that you can scan to also get to the information about the project, but also the data that are available. A project we're currently working on is kind of an elaboration of that. It's expanding out to 4 other islands around Majuro, Iban, and the atolls. You can see here where we've worked with MIX, the Marshall Islands Conservation Society, to go out with the land and survey and collect ground control points, and then those get delivered back to our collaborators at Hilo and at USGS to try and get elevation information and then allow for the development of inundation exposure models. That has been going on since pre-pandemic. And hopefully moving along soon. As you can imagine, there were a lot of hiccups in getting over to some of the islands, and in general getting some of the technology there in the past couple of years. A couple other projects just to mention in terms of impacts to some of the natural habitats and what are also serve as sort of resources for the local community. So we're looking at sea level rise, impacts on mangroves, and also the interaction of coral reefs and mangroves, and the interaction with sea level rise and coral reef and mangroves, and coastal flooding hazards. So in places like Kosrae and Yap and Pohnpei. One tool we're also working on, John Marra kind of alluded to it, the difference in looking at sea level rise in American Samoa because of their subsidence issue. We and Brad showed you a version of the sea level rise viewer, which is also captured here in this image. But we're currently underway developing one for American Samoa. Again, you can grab onto this QR code when you have the opportunity to do so, but it's in collaboration with a few folks in American Samoa, as well as USGS and the Sea Level Center. So in a couple years, or maybe a year, we'll have, I would say a year, excuse me, some tool to be able to assess what to be able to build a sea level rise viewer for American Samoa, and it will be the first that incorporates some of the subsidence issues. So some of these I know don't directly affect your geographical region, but I believe would be transferable to your region with the right resources. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Heather, for this presentation. I hope the discussion was very useful for you all, because this is a big topic that we've had in the region, especially regarding sea level rise and king tide events. And this is also having impacts on stuff like storm surge, for example. And so, let me see, I'm trying to share my screen actually. But we have to think about this. When you have this nuisance flooding event, how often do these flood events occur across your islands, your atolls? And then how much more frequently will these occur? How much higher will the water become? And so these projections will help give an idea as we move forward over the next couple of years and decades, especially when it comes to planning and development and growth across the islands and the atolls. So I believe as we're moving forward, first off, I want to open up the floor for any questions before we go on to the next speaker. So any questions? I've not seen any coming through the chat, but feel free to put it in the question. Go ahead.
This is John. Can I do a quick comment?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to be clear though on the 2022 report and kind of the outcomes. We're not talking about a foot of sea level rise by mid-century. We're talking about a half a foot, so it's less than that. Similarly, we're probably not talking about a meter sea level rise by the end of the century. It's probably less than that now. Maybe it's 3/4 of a meter, but I think it's important to note that. And then to really, it's really a bumpy ride is what we're looking at. So as we're slowly rising, increasing sea level, we have this La Nina events that are bumping it up 20 or 30 centimeters. And so when you have high, when you have storms and happening during those time periods, that's when you're going to get all those frequent flood events. And you may have periods where it isn't so bad. Similarly, depending on where you're in the tidal cycle, your tidal cycle has 18.6 year tidal cycle, and it can vary on the order of 10 or 20 centimeters. So it's not going to be this steady climb. It's going to be kind of this bumpy thing. Thanks.
All right, thanks, John. We did have David Okada. He's raised his hand. So David, I've unmuted you, and if you're able to speak through your microphone, please do so now.
Yes, audio check. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. This is a very interesting brief so far, and it's only because I don't know, but I'd just like to pose a question. With all this data, and there's a lot of good names in your slides I see are good collaboration individuals, but the secondary effect of all of this stuff so far, like GPA, GWA, DPW, has all this information been funding and dialogue has been ongoing so far to kind of mitigate these infrastructure areas that are at least at sea level, like Tumon? And how does this also affect the Guam's freshwater reservoir? Will that be coming out in a conversation later on, or is there at least discussion about the impacts of those critical infrastructure for Guam in the future? And what might be that tipping point where we must do something, or are we already kind of like too late? Thanks.
All right, this is Landon over here on Jenny's computer right now, so I hope you can hear me fine. I just lost connection on my own computer, but I want to open up the floor to our next opener. We have the ambassador, US Ambassador to Palau, Ambassador John Hennessey-Niland. So Ambassador, if you are on the screen and able to provide your opening remarks, we would be glad to have you. I understand there were some technical problems over there on the embassy side across the region, so I hope you are able to join us now.
Hello, this is the U.S. Ambassador to Palau. I hope you can hear me. Perhaps someone can raise their hand if they can't. It's fortunate that I'm joining late, but I have to be honest, the last 15, 20, 30 minutes was very interesting listening to the true experts on this issue. I want to begin by thanking both Landon and Genevieve and the U.S. National Weather Service and all of the Weather Service offices and our island nation partners who are gathered here today virtually. I hope next time we can do this in person to discuss weather and climate and its impact, particularly in the Western Pacific, the northern part of the Western Pacific. I've had the great honor to serve as the U.S. ambassador here for 2.5 years or so now, and that period included Typhoon Sergei. And I really, really do want to commend and to thank the great work of the entire interagency and inter-island teams that worked so hard during that period on that particular weather event. And I know that's only one of many that have crossed this region, and apparently it would appear that we're having more than ever before. I think there's no doubt about that whatsoever. And even though that was only a Category 1 typhoon, it did linger and cause significant damage to the Republic of Palau. Fortunately, there was no loss of life. And I think, in all honesty, that's because of the work of what you do. And I mean that sincerely, all of you. The coordination and the cooperation, the heads up, the WhatsApp groups that were created at the time, the work between the US agencies, their island counterparts, ranging from Guam to Hawaii to the mainland and to all the islands impacted by that particular storm. I think just one example of what you do every day, but that was the one time I really saw it in action. And since then, we've had a couple of near misses here in Palau. And I'm no expert, but I'm told that that typically wasn't the case, that Palau wasn't impacted to the degree it is now. And I think that's, again, an indicator if anything is needed to demonstrate the change that is taking place in terms of climate and its impact on the environment. We were very fortunate to have the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, Secretary Kerry, to host together with Palau the 2022 Our Ocean Conference that was held in person here in Palau. And that was a major moment and a historic one with, I think, over $10 billion worth of new commitments to action on ocean-related issues impacted by climate. And certainly, sitting here, my window looks over Palau's famous rock islands. We can see the impact of weather. And my local staff tell me that it is changing these patterns and that we need to do something about it, to be honest. And we are doing what we can here at this US Embassy to address climate, environmental, and weather issues. Just a small example, not directly related to the conversation we're having today, but some of you may be aware, and it was announced at the Our Ocean Conference, that US Embassy Koror is the first net zero US Embassy anywhere in the world. And I think that's quite an accomplishment, modest that it may be. And actually, with our solar array that we now have here at the embassy, we are giving energy back to the grid here in Palau, doing our bit to reduce the stress and the strain on climate and the environment, hopefully making a little bit of an impact in this regard. But really, I was asked to speak, and I was very happy to speak because truly, and I don't mean to overemphasize this, your work saves lives. Here in the Pacific, rising sea levels really do matter and are visible. And no matter how long it will take, we need to take every effort to do what we can to mitigate those impacts. I don't know if we can reverse them. I'm not the scientist, but I know that sea levels are having a dramatic impact even here in Palau, which is not one of those island nations that are going to be first affected by that situation. And so anything we can do here at our modest embassy, our small embassy, we are doing together with our great partners. And I do want to thank all of our island participants who work closely with the US agencies. We need you. We need your participation with us. We need your help. You are the local experts. And lastly, and this is very sincere, Palau is one of the few places that is open. You can come here, you can travel here. So for our colleagues in Guam and Hawaii and on the mainland, please hopefully you will have the opportunity to visit truly what is the pristine paradise of Palau. And we would welcome you because climate is so important here. We call in the Department of State what we do at each post, that is our integrated country strategy. We just reworked Embassy Palau's integrated country strategy. There are only 3 priorities that we identified. Climate is very much one of those 3, together with capacity building. The third is another C, but I think you can guess what that one is. But what you do matters so much and is such an important part of what we do here in Palau. So thank you for the invitation to address this conference. Thank you from the bottom of our heart for all the work that everyone did preparing for and in response to Typhoon Sergei. And I know that we can rely on your expertise and your assistance in the event of future weather events. Thank you so much. Mahalo, Sulang. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those kind words. And you hit on a lot of fantastic points that really this whole region, we are on the front line of sea level rise and climate and everything that affects the globe on a larger scale. And so we have to look at the 5 to 7 day weather. What are we looking at in the coming days? Typhoons, tropical cyclones of a variety of sizes and intensities, but also what are we looking at in the next 1 to 2 years, 3 years, 10 years down the road? And how do we project our planning and our development and our growth across the islands? And how do we counteract for threats to our food security, our food sources? And so a lot of great points you brought up, and then also getting our mission done. Right now I'm on Plan C. I was talking to Francine at your office just a little while ago with the technical difficulties, and it was also affecting the embassy folks in RMI and FSM. We always have to have that Plan B and a Plan C and a D, and sometimes that's not enough. And so I'm here in Genevieve's office on her computer, and I might go to my brother's office down the hallway if this one crashes. So we always have to be flexible in this region to protect life and property. And so that's a mission that we take pride in here at the Weather Service and across the islands with our US government interests, our partners in this endeavor, but also the compact states. So all the work coming out of the Weather Service offices across the region, it's so important to our success to protect life and property. And I hope to take you up on your offer and visit your embassy in Palau in July. Hopefully that will work out, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Now we're going to segue over, and thank you again, Ambassador, for your time and your remarks. We're going to segue. I think there was a couple of questions regarding the sea level rise. I think let's spend one more minute or two, Leanne, if we could take care of that one question that remains, and then we'll go to our next presentation. So Leanne?
Yeah, sorry, David, I know you kind of got cut off, but after asking your question, I didn't know if it looked like Brad was going to jump in and say something. Brad, if you remember the comments that you had following David's question, you can speak up now. Otherwise, it looks like we've got a question from Herman and another one from David Hitzel.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't have much to offer on that Guam specific question. I think that was a real site specific question, pointed out important issues about tipping points for sea level rise, because I can speak to Hawaii specifically, we do see tipping points really around 2-3 feet of sea level rise, where we get really high increase in the amount of modeled overwash that happens along the shoreline at that point. So it'd be important to look at that for all the islands, including Guam, like what are those geologic tipping points for wave run up and flooding, but I don't have the specific answers for Guam.
This is John. I was going to say there are a couple of projects underway, or at least certainly folks thinking about it, maybe not all the way underway, but to do what we're calling, you can call it as benchmarking, and that's to go identify the elevations of all sorts of key things like airport runway elevations, roads, critical facilities and infrastructure, and be able to link that back up to the sort of water level data that we're looking at it, whether it's tide gauge or run up, full wave attack. But so there are projects along those lines, certainly in process. Thanks.
All right,
This
thanks
is Heather.
everybody.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I was just referencing the freshwater comment in Guam. That came up a lot in the Office of Insular Affairs meeting here in Honolulu regarding the infrastructure law. There seemed to be there was a lot of representation from Guam, specifically more focused on, infrastructure of getting fresh water to actual locations, more than it was an issue of sea level rise infiltrating some of the sea level, some of the fresh water. I do think there are projects underway, specifically with USGS Water Science Center, but I think it's important, just one of the things that could maybe come out of this meeting is between Brad and John and I and many others working in this field of sea level rise, to be connected with folks who may have those questions, and then be able to identify a research project or funding or an opportunity to get at that specific question, or where it might be a problem specifically on the island. Because you're right, I think right now what we've provided are, this is what will look like on that coastline, given certain events, but how it impacts freshwater systems would be a different thing we need to undertake, but welcome that opportunity.
Great, thank you, Heather, and thank you for all of the wonderful discussion on sea level rise across the Pacific region. Now we'll move on to Tara. Tara, I've given you presenter ability, so when you're ready, you can start sharing your screen.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present. It's an honor to be able to share our work with this audience today. Is that okay? Do you see my presentation?
Yes, looks perfect.
Okay, thank you. My name is Tara Mccaw, and I'm with Catholic Relief Services, and I'm based in Los Angeles, California today. But I was fortunate to get to live in Yap, Micronesia from 2017 to 2019. And during that time, I visited Chuuk and Pohnpei states, and I worked on some of the projects that I'm going to talk about today. I want to start my presentation with a brief introduction to my organization, Catholic Relief Services. CRS is the official international humanitarian agency of the Catholic community in the United States. It started in 1943 to assist refugees during World War II, and our headquarters is based in Baltimore, Maryland, but we work in 114 countries around the world. And we provide relief in emergency situations, and we also do sustainable development projects. You might have noticed we have a religious name, Catholic, but our projects are for everybody, regardless of their religion, race, or nationality. Okay. This slide shows where we work and a few quick statistics about CRS. And this map is too zoomed in to see Micronesia, but it's on the map. And we have over 7,000 staff around the world, and we serve almost 160 million people. At CRS, we do a lot of different types of programming around the world. We respond to disasters, we do health programming, education, disaster risk reduction. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus on food security. So this slide shows a few points about CRS's food security programming around the world in fiscal year 21. So I'll just highlight a few of the points. So we have given out over $75 million in cash and vouchers, and we reached almost 900,000 farmers and increased their agriculture productivity by 57%. So at CRS, we're an organization that's been around a long time, but we're relatively new to Micronesia. We opened our first office in Yap State in 2017, so about 5 years ago, and then we expanded to Chuuk State in 2019 after Typhoon Tip. And our programming sectors are agriculture, food security, disaster risk management, WASH, and saving and internal lending communities. I'm going to briefly go over 2 of our projects, and then I'm going to dig a little deeper into some of the aspects of the projects. So our first project is called our Act on Yap project, and it's funded by USAID BHA. And for this project, we partnered with the College of Micronesia, FSM, the Cooperative Research and Extension Program, who's doing amazing work in Micronesia. The project started in 2017 and it had 2 phases. So in the first phase, we reached 400 farmers on Yap proper. And then in the second phase of the project, which started in 2019, we expanded to 200 additional farmers in 3 of the outer islands of Yap State. And the program activities included training for the farmers and then providing inputs. So the way the projects work is that either our staff, CRS staff, or CRE, COM staff, or our partner staff, or our field agents provided training for some of the farmers. And we also provided either vouchers. So on Yap State, the farmers were given vouchers that they could use in local stores to get supplies that they needed for their farms. So shovels, seeds, planting materials, whatever the farmers needed, they could choose with the vouchers. And then for the programming on the outer islands, because there's no stores, CRS, we talked to the beneficiaries, the farmers, about what they needed, and then we brought the materials over via ships. There's 2 points on this slide that talk about some of the results of our project. This is from the first phase of Act on Yap, because we're still wrapping up the second phase of Act on Yap, so we don't have the final results of the project available yet. But for the first phase, the number of months of food self-sufficiency reported by the beneficiaries at the end of the project was 11.85 months, and this is a 1-month increase from the beginning of the project. And then 89% of the beneficiaries reported that they adopted resilient practices as a result of the project. Our other project I'd like to talk about is our GROW project, and it is funded by USAID BHA, and we partnered with the Chuuk Women's Council on that project. And the project was implemented on 30 islands affected by Typhoon Wutip, and Typhoon Wutip was in February 2019. And we provided agriculture kits to 1,341 farmers and community materials like chippers and wheelbarrows to the 30 islands. This map shows the locations for the GROW project. So there was 4 islands in Yap State, and then 1 island in Pohnpei, and then the rest of the islands were in Chuuk State. So one of our major outputs of our GROW project was that we had the opportunity to develop a climate resilient agriculture curriculum, and we use that curriculum in the GROW project, and then we also will use it for future projects. So we're very happy that we have it to be able to use in our future projects. This slide shows the 12 modules that make up the curriculum, and then the key behaviors are listed too that should come from the education that the beneficiaries get from the modules. We were able to bring out an agriculture expert. This was in 2019, so before the pandemic, and the expert was able to come to FSM and go to the outer islands where the project was being implemented and talk to the beneficiaries and help us with this curriculum in place. So right now the curriculum consists of a facilitation guide for our field agents, and then posters. I'll show the poster. So simple posters to be hung in the communities that the farmers can look at to learn some of the skills. So we tried to keep it simple, step by step, and different pictures to make them visually interesting. This one's in English, of course, for this presentation, but it's translated into Chuukese. And the way that the project is, our CRS staff, we train the field agents on the curriculum, and then the field agents who are based living on the islands, they were the ones who trained the farmers, and they were able to then provide because they lived on the islands, they were able to answer the farmers' questions or help them follow-up questions if they had problems down the line, and do monitoring of the farmers and their growing their gardens. Here is another example of one of the posters that was created with their curriculum. So this shows some of the problems that some of the farmers could have been facing with their crops on the left of the slide. And then it explains maybe they're having this problem because essential nutrients are missing from the soil. And then on the right hand side, it shows like very simple things that can be added to compost and then applied to the soil that can put the nutrient back into the soil so that the plants will do better. And it's all simple things that people have access to, like ash or manure or sea cucumbers. So of course, people who are on these remote outer islands, they don't have access to stores where they can go and buy fertilizer or potting soil or anything like that. So they need to use what's available to them. I wanted to obviously won't go through all of the climate resilient agriculture practices that are in the curriculum, but I'll just cover a few of them just to give you a bit of an example, so you understand what I'm talking about when I talk about climate resilient agriculture practices. So one of the things that the farmers are taught about is mulching. So, and some of the benefits of mulching is that it controls weeds, it conserves soil moisture, it fertilizes the soil, it builds soil structure, and then it can stop soil erosion, which is a huge issue that a lot of these islands are facing. Another thing that people are taught under with the curriculum is that how to make fertilizer out of papaya leaves. So papaya leaves are something that are readily available on the islands. And then that photo shows one of our field agents using the papaya seeds to make the fertilizer. And the fertilizer, it provides sandy soils with the nutrients that they can be lacking, and it helps vegetables produce stronger yields. And then, yeah, this slide shows a few of our practices. So composting, it captures and holds water, oxygen, and essential plant nutrients, and the soil is less likely to be eroded away by the wind and storms. And then with container gardening, it allows greater control over soil fertility, and because you can add compost or fertilizer to the container, and you can control like what nutrients the plants are getting. You can also control drainage and water management. You control how much water the plants are getting, as opposed to if you're planting in the land. And the containers can also be moved to avoid hazards. So if there's any flooding, you can move the plants, which you couldn't normally do. Or if there's wind, you could put the plants under cover. In 2021, CRS, had the opportunity to go back and talk to some of our beneficiaries, the farmers that we worked with under the Act on Yap project. So these are farmers that we worked with between 2017 and 2019. And we wanted to go back and talk to them about some of if they were still using the practices that they had learned under the first phase of our project, and how their farms were going, just to go back and check and make sure that our program was still useful to people, and that we were on the right track. So we were happy to see the results. So the blue is strongly agree, and the purple is agree on the chart on the slide. And so one of the questions we asked is that, are the practices, have they helped improve your yield? And the beneficiary said that yes, they strongly agree, 77%, and then 21% agree. And then another question was asked was, have the practices improved the soil quality? And 64% said they strongly agree, and 28% said they agree. So we were happy to see that. And then we also talked to people about what they were using their crops for. So 97% of the beneficiaries that we talked to said that they consume, 28% said that they sell, and 46% say that they give them away. And so like everybody in the world, our work was affected by the challenges that came with the global pandemic over the last few years. One of the big issues was that there was lack of transportation options to the outer islands, and that delayed some of our programming. And so some of the ships that usually go to the outer islands were not available to go between like 2020, 2021, but recently they started up again, so that's been great. And there's also delays in procurement of some of the agriculture items that we were giving to the farmers because of the global shipping delays, but fortunately that's picked up also. And then we had big plans to bring in more technical advisors and experts to support our projects, but of course with the travel restrictions that wasn't possible. I wanted to show this map here because it gives a little bit when I talk about like the transportation channels. I show this slide to emphasize how remote some of these islands are that we work on. So this map shows the path of one of the trips that some of our staff took to the outer islands. I didn't have the pleasure of going on this trip, but my colleagues did. So what they did was they flew from Yap proper to Wooley, and then they took a canoe from Wooley to Aydlett, and it took 13.5 hours, and then they spent some time in Aydlett doing their work and project activities. Then they took the ship to 19 hours to Aydeltt, stayed for a few days, then took the ship the canoe 42.5 hours to Aydeltt. So very, very remote places. So if we don't have access to transportation, it's a real issue. And then, of course, though, with challenges come opportunities. So with the limited transportation opportunities, they allowed us to look for ways to partner and coordinate locally with other groups so that we could get to these remote outer islands. So in Chuuk, when there were limited boats and they did start running, we coordinated with the Disaster Coordination Office and Ministry of Health and Department of Education to go on ships that they chartered to the outer islands. And then we also, one of the opportunities I found was that we were able to engage virtually, like instead of, for example, for when we're working with our partners, we usually go and we do a lot in person to go over the financial monitoring and the monitoring and evaluation of the project. But we were able to move a lot of that online and work with them remotely. Personally, I will be so excited when we can finally travel again and I can get back to Micronesia. But until then, we do have a system in place where we can do things remotely. We have CRS. We are fortunate enough to have 2 new projects that are starting up in 2022 that are focused on food security. The first is our ADAPT project, and that's funded by USAID, BHA, and it's similar to our WFO Yap project that I spoke about, but it's focused more on Chuuk State, and we'll have 450 farmers in Chuuk State that we will be working with, and we'll be partnering with the Chuuk Women's Council on that project. And then we're also going to be working on the Aspire project, which is funded by USAID, the Pacific American Fund through Social Solutions. And that is a pilot project for CRS in Yap State, and we'll be forming 3 farmer groups with 50 of the farmers that we worked with on previous projects, and providing them with additional training, additional agriculture support through vouchers, and then linking them with local markets to help them sell more of their crops on the local markets if that's what they're interested in. So maybe next year if we have a webinar again, we can share more about how those projects go. But thank you so much for this opportunity to present, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Tara, for this incredible presentation. I think it's eye-opening even for myself. I've been here on Guam for 12 years, and I was in the Marshall Islands for just under 2.5 years. And to see the projects and the coordination that's involved with all these things going on across the Western Pacific, US affiliated Pacific Islands, I think it's impressive because it underscores the amount of coordination and collaboration that goes into the background of all these projects, whether it's with the Catholic Relief Services or USAID response and recovery efforts for disasters or in advance of disasters and just overall survival. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And I think if anybody has questions regarding food security and the presentation that Tara just presented on, do reach out to us because we like to collaborate and learn how we can expand our services, our projects across the region, and how we can learn from each other. And that's really the goal I want to accomplish with this webinar, is the discussion, how we can learn and collaborate with each other across the agencies to make life better for all of us in the Pacific Islands. So Leanne, do you see any questions coming through?
We don't have any questions this time for Tara or the Catholic Relief Services. Oh, it does look like David has a question. David, I'll unmute you. And you should be able to, oh, you're self-muted right now. So David, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. David Hitzel. I think he might have put his hand down. We do have one comment saying that CRS is awesome, impressive work. So kudos out to CRS and Tara.
That's so nice. Thank you.
All right. Well, if there are no further questions, feel free to
All right,
think of
David,
something.
it looks, oh, sorry, David, it looks like you can speak now.
Yeah, somehow I got unmuted. I don't know how, but I think this is a really important topic. And just to like, I don't know if this is more of a statement or a question, but just to tie it into the climate change issue, it would seem like it would be a good idea to focus on crops that are more resilient to, depending on where you're going to be in the tropics, things are supposed to get a little warmer and may get wetter or may get drier. And there may be certain crops that you grow in regions which may become more prone to inundation, saltwater inundation. So I would guess, you're the expert, but I would guess it would be good to focus on growing crops that are more resilient to those kind of conditions, and or work on protecting the ones that aren't so resilient. So that's for Tara to comment on, I guess.
Thank you for your comment. No, that's a very good point. And personally, I'm not an agriculture expert, but we do work with experts at College of Micronesia and at CRS, and then they do help us figure out like which are the more resilient varieties of the crops, and those are the ones that we help link the communities with, so that they can yes, focus on planting things that are more resilient, because we do know that with climate change and sea level rise, things are going to be getting worse and worse. With the container gardening, we promote that for some of the vegetables that are not so much not as easy to grow in the soil, so that you can control the environment, and then you can move them to safer locations. Like if there were to be flooding, saltwater inundation, then they're also a little bit off the ground, so they're less likely to get damaged. Also, if there's storms or anything like that, then you can put them under cover. So no, yeah, you make a very good point about how things will be getting worse, and that's what we're hoping to help prepare the farmers for.
Great, sounds good. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David, for that question. We're going to move on to our next speaker. That will be Dennis from University of Hawaii Sea Grant, talking about the up and coming FSM Homeowners Handbook. We have several of these in production, well, actually already been published for the RMI, the Mariana Islands, and Hawaii. And so this will be the latest addition to that. And so Dennis will talk about this presentation. If you have any questions regarding the previous two presentations, do send them in through the chat. Leanne will capture those, or email us, or just wait till the end of the presentation. So Dennis, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Landon. Did you see the screen?
Not yet. It doesn't look like you're, there we go. It's not in presenter mode yet though.
Okay, I'm gonna put it in presenter mode. And hello everyone, nice to meet you. And it's very informative. All the previous talks, you'll see that we would love to partner with all the previous people, and probably more in this audience. Brad, John, Heather, Tara will be reaching out with you, because we're going to need help with the FSM Homeowners Handbook. So here's the Hawaii book. It's in the 4th edition, and this Hawaii book covers tsunamis, hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods. And in the 4th edition, we added volcanoes and climate change. And the book covers best practices also, which are both have a resilience component, also climate adaptation and environmental sustainability. So there's a lot of overlap. Okay. And the book is actually in 12 states and countries right now, modified off the Hawaii book, but each book is localized for the location. Here you see the Marshall Island book that we did, and now we're in the process of doing one for the Federated States of Micronesia. So here are the partners. This is a preliminary list. A lot of them we haven't even met yet, and I'm sure has been the history for all the books. The list of partners grows over time. So we working with the emergency managers for, say, Chuuk, Yap, Pohnpei, and Kajrai, and also important partner is FSM, Department of Environment, Climate Change, and Emergency Management. We've been in contact a lot with the IOM office, and of course the National Weather Service Weather Forecast Office in Guam. And one of our private partners is Simpson Strong Tie. They make a lot of hurricane ties, or also for a typhoon, and they've been partners in a lot of the previous books. We're working with the United States Geological Survey, actually one of the speakers later is Dr. Karina Surovsky-Dariau, and she'll be talking about the landslide part of the book very shortly. And then we also have one of our consultants is with the UH College of Engineering. I'm a faculty member at UH Sea Grant. And of course, USAID and Tiare Eastmond, she was the one who initiated this project. So the goal of the handbook, wherever it's located, is to prepare families and homes for multiple natural hazards and reduce risk to property and lives. And again, it's tailored for the local hazard risk in the area. We use multiple references are reviewed for applicability and incorporates lessons learned from other disasters. And we do develop new best practices to fill a need, if there is an identified need. A lot of times we can't come up with every solution, but we look forward to working with all of you in the audience to develop, the best practices that will assist people in FSM. Okay, so the key components of the book are hazard risk. You really need to understand the full suite of hazards to prepare. And then we cover emergency supplies, creating an evacuation plan, which is, it's really going to be different for each location, and we're going to have to rely on, also, I have a feeling we're going to have to rely a lot with working with the emergency managers and the local community. And then we deal with strengthening homes to reduce the risk, say from wind or flooding. Okay, so here's the status of the book. It's been delayed somewhat because of COVID, but part 2 is on hazard science, history and risk, and the first draft has been completed. And then part 3 is emergency supplies and evacuation planning. That's in development. And also part 4, hazard mitigation, building and retrofit. That's also in development. So part 3 and 4, part 3, we're gonna have to rely a lot on interviews with the emergency managers and the community. And part 4, it's gonna be important to do some field observations, and that's what's been delaying somewhat the project. Okay, so with regard to hazard risk, so one of the major risks is typhoons. Okay, so this is data from Chip Guard from 1945 to 2017, and it's color coded. The purple is typhoons within 180 nautical miles, and Chip characterized that as a glancing blow. And then typhoons greater than 74 miles per hour within 60 nautical miles, he characterized that as direct hit. And major typhoons with winds over 111 miles per hour sustained within 60 nautical miles, he classified that as a direct hit. So you could see that for Kazrai, they haven't had any major typhoons, where Yap has had 6, and you could see all the other numbers for the glancing blow and direct hits. They all increase as you move across the island. So initially you would say, oh, okay, so you would think that with recent history, the typhoon risk is less for Kazrai and Pohnpei versus Chuuk and Yap. So maybe they don't need to prepare as much. However, when you go very far back and you look at the historical records, and this is a book by called Typhoons in Micronesia by Dirk Spanneman, and you'll see that even in Kazrai and Pohnpei, they had casualties from typhoons. So the bottom line is that all islands must prepare for multiple threats from a typhoon. And when we talk about multiple threats, the typhoon is the event, but the threats from the typhoon are erosion and scour, there's storm surge and wave inundation, there's inland flooding, freshwater flooding, and then there's wind. So all 4 of those need to be considered for, to properly prepare. It's important for emergency and evacuation planning. You may need to evacuate for whether it be storm surge or flooding or wind even, okay? And it's also important for siting of buildings, and also important when we discuss about how do we build houses or how do we retrofit them, okay? So now I would like to have Karina with the USGS come online to maybe introduce yourself. Hi, Karina. And you could talk about this slide, and I'll advance the next one also.
Sure, sounds good, Dennis. Thanks and mahalo nui to Dennis for letting me introduce myself. I'm Karina Sarofsky-Dario. I'm a research geologist working with Stephen Slaughter, and together we're part of the U.S. Geological Survey, USAID Landslide Disaster Assistance Team, or LDAT. And so LDAT works in countries seeking assistance to build their landslide capacity to reduce landslide risk. And so for FSM, we're making updated landslide susceptibility maps for the 4 states. So this project builds on past USGS work with new insight from field observations and local knowledge. And then we're working with Dennis to include landslide hazards in this homeowners guide that he's discussing right now. So obviously, and looking at this picture, landslides aren't an unknown hazard to FSM, and many of you are likely well aware of that hazard. And these landslides often start in the mountains, but they can travel to flat areas and can be a danger to houses, like seen here in this picture. This is the Kneecap landslide in Chuuk State. And this was came after Typhoon Chatan, and Chatan caused more than 250 landslides on Chuuk and killed many people, unfortunately. So this image is from a 2004 USGS report and map that were done following that event, and starting to work on a landslide assessment for the island. And Dennis, if you go to the next slide.
Sure.
And to better show where landslides might start and how far they might go, we're using a new tool that's in development with the USGS to make these multicolored maps. And so this is just an example you see here, but it's highlighting where landslides would start moving. So that is the red areas, where they would likely stop, and that is that orange and yellow. And then if they do make it to, hold on a second. One second. Hold on. So we had a visitor in the office. So then the last part is the purple part, and that's where the landslides, if they reach a stream or a channel, they can actually start moving even faster and further, and they may be very far from where the landslides actually started. And so highlighting all those areas is very important for planning purposes and kind of understanding the risk. And this project is just getting started, but we hope to have many more maps to share in the near future. So thank you.
Thank you, Karina. So this is very important. It's really something to be considered because they've had casualties from typhoons in FSM. Now we see casualties from landslides in FSM, and the guidance for what to do is a little different because for a typhoon, your natural inclination is to go inland or to higher ground. But for a landslide, when a lot of them occur during typhoons, the inclination is to go to the coastline. So this is something we're going to need to work on with the emergency managers over time. Okay, so let me proceed. Okay, also in the book, we cover flooding hazards, and they could be caused by numerous causes. So everyone remembers, or a lot of the people in the area remember, the December 3rd and 9th inundation event, partly caused by king tide. So we explain what king tides are and the impact, and also how extratropical storms and nearby storms or trade wind surges could also combine with the king tide to create inundation events. And also another factor, we do have climate change. So there are some factors unrelated to climate change that will increase flooding risk, and some factors related to climate change that will increase flooding risk. So one is the sea level rise, and this is data from 1993 to 2020 for Pohnpei, and it's a combination of satellite data and tide gauge data from the UH Sea Level Center and University of Colorado Boulder and NASA Jet Propulsion Lab. And as John mentioned in his previous talk, they expect sea level rise to accelerate. To what extent is unknown, but it's going to lead to more frequent and severe inundation events, and that could also impact food supplies and water shortages, which we're going to try and address in part 4 of the book. So now we're still on part 2 of the book. Okay, so another climate change issue we have to deal with is drought. So a lot of the hazards we cover in the book, we try and give the big picture, like how the hazard will impact not just one of the states, but all 4 of the states. And here's the US drought monitor, and you can see areas are classified D0 to D4, D1 is Chuuk Lagoon, D2 is over there also. And this US drought monitor, we tell people how to access the site, how to look up the data, and it's updated every week. And then there are bi-weekly statements from the National Weather Service on Guam for areas on D2 drought or worse. And so that's drought, and that's really unrelated to climate change, because it's occurred many years, before there was an issue with climate change, but climate change is expected to make the problem worse because over time, there's a trend of less rainfall. And you can see rainfall from 1950 to 2009 for Pohnpei. And this is from an Australian aid report. So with less rainfall, there's going to be more drought. So that will be combination of some factors related to climate change and some unrelated. Okay, some other hazards we cover in the book. They don't appear to be as, well, I shouldn't say that, but the first one is tsunamis. And at least tsunamis, they haven't had the historical impact they've had in, say, Hawaii. But that doesn't mean FSM is immune to tsunamis. And this is just a tsunami modeling of a magnitude magnitude 8 earthquake off New Guinea, and it reaches Micronesia in under 2 hours, a wave height of 3 to 9 feet. So that's something we're going to have to think about. Another hazard that will be in the FSM book is for earthquakes, and here we're working with the USGS, and appears the greatest risk is the locations that are closest to the trench systems, Yap and Mariana Trench. And here's just an example of the shallow earthquakes near the Yap Trench are in red, and then their deeper ones in green for the Mariana Trench. And then coastal erosion, coastal processes and how beaches are formed and erode, they could threaten properties. And we'll look forward to working with Brad and Heather on that one. Okay, so we just concluded what we have so far for the hazard part of the book. But that's part 2. Part 3 is emergency supplies, and we need to work with the emergency managers on what are appropriate emergency supplies for FSM. Here's a list of emergency supplies that they deemed were important for the Marshall Islands. So this is from the Marshall Islands book, and we hope the emergency managers at FSM could take a look at this and give us input on what they think is applicable or not. Okay, evacuation planning is very important. So are people in FSM able to shelter in place during a typhoon? Is their place strong enough for the wind? Is it away from storm surges and flooding or landslides? So it's it's something to consider. So this is just an example of a shelter in place table that's in the Hawaii book. It took a while to figure out how it is, but essentially you have to compare how strong the house is to how strong the wind event is, assuming that it's not in a flood or storm surge zone. And it's possible to make the house stronger by retrofitting it. So make it more likely to shelter in place. Okay. And if the houses are not strong enough, we can't guarantee we're going to be able to do this for FSM, but we were able to do it for the Marshall Islands. One of the people on our team is a professor of engineering, and he helped us classify different buildings as suitability for evacuation, like for vertical evacuation, say for a tsunami or a storm surge, and we were able to prioritize some of the buildings on Majuro, which would be good for evacuation. So we may be able to do this for FSM. We won't really know until we're out in the field and we get to see everything. Of course, the main part of the book will what homeowners can do to prevent damage from wind, flooding, and to address, say, water and food security issues. Okay, so the top left is a house in FSM damaged by Typhoon Utep, and it actually has a similar type of construction to the house in the bottom right is a house in RMI. They're both made with concrete walls, and they have concrete columns, those green or purple things that are going from the foundation up to the base of the roof, and those are called concrete structural bond beams. And one of the key things is attaching the roof to that house structure. Now, it's going to be that we may actually recommend something different, whether they're in Yap versus Kazrai, because in the say the Marshall Islands, the expected winds are not as strong as they could be, say, in Yap, which has experienced major typhoons. Okay, the key thing we're going to include in the book are, say, tying down the houses, whether it be externally or internally, and what we're going to work with Simpson Strong Tie and other experts, also people at IOM who we've been in contact with, but we just started, and it really won't get full tilt until we get to visit FSM. Okay, this just shows an example of actually one of these people. That's Tim Waite. He's one of the people that will be at on our field team, and just looking at guidance for building stronger roofs. And this may be suitable for Marshall Islands, but may not be strong enough for FSM. Okay, these are just some of the things we were recommending. Making sure the top plate was tied down to the structure, of the house, adding hurricane clips to tie the trusses and rafters to the top plate, making sure the roofs were properly tied with screws and washers to the roof and purlins. Okay, and one of the things we also covered in the Marshall Islands book is water security. So we covered water catchment systems, maintenance, first flush systems, and we're open to any best practices. It's important to know that this FSM book is the book for people at FSM. So if you have any best practices for building stronger, for water security, for food security, like Tara just described with the CRS program, we could put those in the book, and hopefully that will help people with all the threats that they have. Okay, so that's all we have today, and this is our contact information. If you want to email us and have any questions or comments or best practices you think we should know about, give us, shoot us an email. We look forward to it. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for that information. And I think you did a fine job hitting on a number of topics that we like to discuss out here in the region regarding all hazards from natural varieties like drought and flood, storm surge, wind damage, food, of course, but also tropical cyclones. And of course, I like to remind people, especially all of us here at the National Weather Service, is that you don't have to have a direct hit by a tropical cyclone to feel the effects. And I refer to it as the no-name storm, that you can have a developing disturbance that can drop significant amounts of rainfall on an island, cause significant problems with mudslides and landslides. This can be a slow-moving system. And think back to Tropical Storm Mccaw back in the Philippines earlier this year in April. It sat nearly stationary over parts of central southern Philippines. and drop significant rainfall, causing profound problems over there. And so we like to remind people it does not have to have a name or a number affixed to it before it can cause problems. And so you have to keep that in mind. So any questions? We're going to have maybe about 30 seconds for a question. I don't know that I see any questions in the chat, but if you have questions for Dennis, please do put them in the chat and we can address those. In the meantime, we will go ahead, Dennis.
Sorry, Landon. I just forgot to mention one thing for part 3, where we talk about emergency supplies and evacuation planning. Evacuation planning is very important, that the communities also work with the National Weather Service and Weather Service Office in Guam. And so a big part of that chapter is going to be on your products that you provide to, like, you know, the emergency managers in all 4 states on, like, you know, if there's like a typhoon watch, typhoon warning, flood, you know, all the warning aspects. We're going to have to really hash it out in the book for the homeowners.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. And as Dennis also mentioned, we have a web of weather service presence across the region within the Pacific region headquarters of the National Weather Service. So we have weather offices that we work closely with across all the main islands of the region, and then they also communicate to the outermost islands so that everybody can get that information. Also, go ahead and Leanne, pull up Brandon's slides. Brandon Aydeltt, the Science and Operations Officer from here at WFO Guam, will be presenting about some of the new probabilistic forecast charts that we'll be using in tropical cyclone forecasts coming up soon. Many of us are used to the traditional HURRIVAC graphics or the deterministic graphics that you see in the newspaper, the media, in our heavy weather briefs. We have some new charts that will be coming out, and we want to explain to you what they are and how to interpret them before they start rolling out in mainstream. So Brandon, the floor is yours.
All right, so good morning. I'm Brandon Aydlett, brother of Landon. We are twins, so there is that familial resemblance. I am the Science and Operations Officer here at WFO Guam, and so I wanted to introduce you to a couple of some new graphics that we will be gradually phasing into our tropical cyclone warning communications across the West Pacific. And so these graphics are going to be somewhat similar to what we've seen in the Central Pacific and also in the Atlantic hurricane basin. The graphics exist through the Central Pacific Hurricane Center and also the National Hurricane Center, and they are being produced now for us in the West Pacific by the CPHC and National Weather Service Honolulu. So these graphics have been around for a while, but they will be brand new for us in the Western Pacific. And ultimately, the purpose of these graphics is to better convey the inherent uncertainty in tropical cyclone motion and intensity. So what we have been used to over the past 10, 15 years are the graphics produced via HURRIVAC, an emergency manager's tool for displaying the forecast track of tropical cyclones and the wind radii of tropical storm, force winds, and typhoon force winds. So this is what we're accustomed to. On the left is the error track and showing the white shaded area where 2/3 of the storm centers, not the entire storm, but 2/3 of the storm centers are usually found, although sometimes the storm center can veer outside of that track. And I will show you some of those scenarios shortly. On the right side, that is our wind radii. This is for a sample typhoon scenario that we use for training within the weather office here. And so in the blue, you see the tropical storm force winds exceeding 39 miles per hour, the yellow indicating 50 miles per hour or greater. And then also the pinkish red, that would be the typhoon force winds. So the question is, with these graphics that we're used to, how do we properly convey the uncertainty of a tropical cyclone motion? What if the storm moves faster? What if the storm moves slower? How about the storm shifts to the north or south of the track, changing the risk of passage to all the different islands across Micronesia or the Marianas? How do we convey that? Currently, with the sample storm, Guam is still several days ahead of the storm, but would we really want to highlight the exactness of a 150-mile-per-hour typhoon passing right over Guam 4 days from this current image. And the reality is, no, we'd want to go ahead and urge some level of caution and uncertainty. But again, how about storm intensification? We've seen a lot of forecast storms that were expected to come through the Marianas as 120, 130 mile per hour storms. And then sometimes that intensity plateaus at a tropical storm level. And so instead of intensifying, that storm plateaus at about a 60 mile per hour storm. That was the case with 2015's Typhoon Dolphin that just did not intensify as rapidly as we expected. But as it crossed between Guam and Rota, that's when it was quickly intensifying into the Philippine Sea. This is one of the tools in Hurryback that we use to do a point-by-point wind timing that we brief out to the emergency managers. And so in the case here, we're looking at 24 hours out. And so we're looking at the onset of tropical storm force winds exceeding the 39 mile per hour threshold. So 24 hours out, and then 31 hours out for whatever point this is on the map, we're looking at the onset of typhoon force winds exceeding 74 miles per hour. And so this changes every 6 hours with the new forecast track and forecast timing. So the problem from a forecast and briefing standpoint is this is the deterministic wind timing for a single point forecast, but it does change from time to time that the storm veers north or south, east or west, moves faster or slower, and how can we better convey those changes? So I'm going to do a quick briefing of some of the new graphics that will be at our disposal. And the first one is the error track. So this one's going to stay in our suite of graphics. So basically, we're showing the potential, the likely potential position of the center of a tropical cyclone. And of course, we always urge, don't focus solely on the center black line. While the center black line is the current expectation for the storm motion and forecast track, it can veer left or right and to some extent. And then how about the extent of the tropical storm force damaging winds? Sometimes those impacts are felt well out, actually, they're always felt outside of this shaded area. So let's take a look at Tropical Storm Dolphin. Tropical Storm Dolphin, it formed in Pohnpei State, and then it kind of meandered for several days, almost back toward Koshrai as it became a tropical depression, and then it lifted northward, and then gradually started making its westward turn toward the Marianas. Here's a position for the 4-day forecast track of Tropical Storm Dolphin. And so where did that 4-day position actually verify? It was quite a bit farther to the right. So if we look at this graphic, probably most users would look at this and think, okay, Saipan-Tinian, not a lot of risk. But the reality is Dolphin tracked on the far right side of that cone. And so there's quite a bit increased wind and rainfall impacts for Tinian and Saipan. In fact, for a little while, the storm actually passed outside of the shaded cone area. So this is one of those things that we try to convey to the general public, to emergency managers, to always take in consideration. These storms will move left or right, faster or slower. And so we're going to be trying to convey that uncertainty with our forecast. So some of the new graphics we have are the wind speed probabilities. And so these graphics are created for 34 knot, the tropical storm, 50 knot destructive winds, and the 64 knot typhoon force winds. And so here on the left, I've displayed the 34 knot wind speed probabilities. So it is showing anywhere there is some small chance of tropical storm force winds. So for this sample storm, you can pretty much infer that the storm track is going to go along this line, but yet Guam has a risk of tropical storm wind conditions, and then to a lesser extent Rota, and then not really any risk for Tinian and Saipan. How are these produced? They are produced through a Monte Carlo simulation, and so every 6-hour forecast track that we receive from Joint Typhoon Warning Center, these Monte Carlo simulations run 1,000 different realistic alternative tracks with the starting information. It factors in the 5-year forecast track errors, model certainty, and model spread. And then it also does account for the reduction of wind speeds over land due to that surface friction. And of course, that's a more significant consideration for larger land masses, such as the continental US. But 1,000 scenarios are run to give us these wind speed probabilities. So where you see a 10% chance of winds, that means 100 of those simulations had tropical storm force winds over that area. So right here over Guam and closer to Rota. So this is what the Monte Carlo simulation looks like. There's 1,000 runs of an individual track. This is Typhoon U2 as it was approaching the Marianas. And so you can see just what the model spread of all those different 1,000 tracks look like. And of course, as we're going from the yellow, yellow is category 1 typhoon, then orange category 2, red is category 3. And then of course, we've got a lot of the ensemble members turning purple, and even the gray indicating that category 4, 5 super typhoon intensity. And so ultimately at this point in Typhoon U2, all of the Marianas could have seen some risk of typhoon force winds. So we'll go into a couple of comparisons real quick. This is 2021's Tropical Depression Minduli, 20W. This storm occurred in the month of September. And so here on the left, we have the error track showing the 2/3 likelihood passage of the center of the storm, and then the hashed area showing the potential extent of the tropical storm winds exceeding 39 miles per hour. And of course, later on, you do see that the storm actually tracked a little bit left of the shaded cone area. On the right, I've overlaid the tropical storm force wind speed probabilities of 5 days. And so you see that there's the extent of the tropical storm hatched winds. But outside of that, there is still a possibility that some of these areas in the open waters, of course, could have seen those tropical storm wind conditions. And that seems quite realistic, especially when you consider on the left that the storm did venture outside of that cone. So this does give a little bit more of a highlighting that even outside of that cone, there is still a small risk of those tropical storm force winds. And so that is what's going to go right straight into our briefings and our heavy weather briefs for the Marianas, and as we communicate across Micronesia for any anticipated tropical cyclone impacts and any TCs that are moving through the region. So again, these probabilistic graphics, they are geared to steer the focus of a tropical cyclone, steer the focus 3 to 5 days out to the possibilities, the uncertainties, and the general risk posed by a region, and not solely on the deterministic dotted black line in the center of a graphic. And so here is a tropical storm Mccaw. Early on, the forecast track had a 130 mile per hour typhoon Mccaw passing right over Guam. And if we have any listeners from the CNMI, you remember very vividly that Rota had the direct impact as the storm shifted a little bit farther to the north. And there's your wind speed probabilities on the top right, showing that Rota has a pretty good chance of seeing the tropical storm winds. Even Tinian, Saipan, and even the far northern Marianas, there's that potential of impacts. But ultimately, we want to redirect the audience focus from the center black line to the broader risk. And so a lot of people still ask the question, what is the CPA, the closest point of approach? And while that has some relevance just to your timing of the storm and the passage, there are some the impacts of rain, flooding rains, battering storm surge and surf, and wind damage. Those potentials extend much farther away from a storm and aren't really that closely related directly to the CPA. In the case of Yap with the tropical storm Malakas back in early May, the impacts of Malakas were worse about 24 hours after the CPA, and that is for the island of Yap. Some of the southwesterlies really increased and the heavy rains developed. So let's dissect 2018's Typhoon Mccaw. We're looking at Advisory 5. We are expecting if you're looking at the Hurricane graphic, we've got a typhoon coming right over Guam. Rota, probably at this forecast, you're not expected to see any winds exceeding or reaching typhoon force. And so that red line indicates the typhoon force wind. So a little bit less for Rota. Tinian, Saipan, just a tropical storm. However, if we look at the wind speed probabilities, for anywhere exceeding a 10% chance of tropical storm or even a 10% chance of a typhoon winds. Tinian and Saipan do have at least a 10% chance of typhoon conditions. Rota is a much higher chance of seeing typhoon conditions. So this is advisory 5. And now let's look at advisory 13. This is 48 hours later. Advisory 5 would probably be consistent with the tropical typhoon watch. But then 48 hours later, as Mangkhut is coming right into the Marianas, look where the storm track is. It is coming right over Rota. And all of a sudden, Tinian is right on the edge of the typhoon force winds. And so we actually have typhoon warnings. That's the red shading around the islands. We do have typhoon warnings for Tinian and Saipan. That might not have been the case looking solely at advisory 5. Tinian, Saipan looks like maybe a strong banana storm for the local terminology. But the reality is the storm shifted north, and now we got the potential for a typhoon. And so through these probabilistic graphics, that should help us with that message. Additionally, we have the time of arrival, and this could probably be a very helpful tool for decision makers, whether you're government partners, emergency managers, or even private businesses and homeowners. So these winds are produced only for tropical storm force winds of 39 miles per hour, because once winds are stronger than that, it's going to be exceedingly difficult and potentially dangerous to continue to do any type of tropical cyclone preparation, especially outside. And so these timings are produced by the Monte Carlo method, those 1,000 model runs. And then ultimately they are great to be used as a decision-making tool when to complete and when to begin and complete your precautionary measures. We have 2 flavors of this. One is the earliest reasonable arrival and the most likely arrival. So first of all, the most likely arrival, looking at those 1,000 tracks, the most likely arrival is when 50% of those tracks have already seen the tropical storm winds begin, and 50%, the remaining 50%, have not yet had those tropical storm force winds developed over a certain area. And so you can see there's a time of day, Tuesday 8 a.m., 2 p.m., Tuesday 8 p.m. And so you can see that progression of the storm. So this is going to be a decent tool for people who may not have so many assets, so many to-dos on their list of preparations for a tropical cyclone. And ultimately, this will definitely be better as a tropical cyclone is closing in on your location, because the closer a storm gets, the more realistic and the closer to reality that 50% of timing will be. So going from a probabilistic standpoint, the closer to the event, probabilistic turns into more of a deterministic with an exact timing. The other tool would be the earliest reasonable arrival time. So this is where only 10% of those 1,000 tracks have already had the tropical storm winds start up on a location. This is when you have a lot of preparations to do. If you have a lot of assets that you need to prepare, to take care of, to deal with, if you have a massive to-do list that takes a lot of time, if you own large facilities that it takes a lot of time to put up your typhoon shutters, aircraft, this is probably what's going to be the better tool for your operations to see what is the earliest tropical storm winds could arrive. And this would probably be better very early in a tropical cyclone event, something probably in the pre-watch, so 48 hours or more before a storm is expected to arrive. And just a reminder, with the National Weather Service out here, we issue the tropical storm, the tropical cyclone watches with 48 hours of lead time, and the tropical cyclone warnings with a 24-hour lead time. So if you need more time than that, this earliest reasonable arrival time would probably be of use to you. So where can you find these graphics? They are being produced, like I said, by the Central Pacific Hurricane Center in Honolulu. They do have a test page on their webpage there, and then we also have it on our webpage at weather.gov/gum. If you have a smartphone, feel free to hold it up to the screen, grab that, and this is the live page. So right now there are no tropical cyclones in our region, so this page will have no new graphics. However, if you would like to see the example page, feel free to use this QR code or these URLs, and you can see what the page looks like when it's populating with new graphics. And feel free to ask me any question. Here's my email address. We're going to be rolling this out over the next several months, especially for later this year as tropical cyclones start ramping up. And so there will be a survey period that we'll put the link on that page soon. We're going to have a 1-year period for surveys. If you have some input, some questions, feel free to send those along. And also, we'll be communicating this on our social media pages as the year progresses. And we'll be incorporating these with our heavy weather briefs and working closely with emergency managers as we continue to kind of massage these new graphics into the operational use. And with that, I will turn it over to Landon.
All right, thank you, Brandon. And you took the words out of my mouth when you mentioned the survey. So just to reiterate, there is a survey open for these products. So we want your feedback. Go to those links that Brandon provided, check those charts out, look them over, and provide your feedback, because it's the feedback from our partners, from the public, that really drives our operations, our products, and what we communicate and work with in the community. So the feedback matters, the good and the bad. So send it all our way. Are there any questions regarding Brandon's presentation? I don't see anything in the chat or the list.
We do have one. It's just asking about these graphics, and will JTWC be adopting them as well?
Well, that's a good question. So the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, they produced their forecast track, and so their tracks are geared more for DoD assets, and so we will take that forecast information, the full text bulletin, and so we'll input that into our HERVAC to create our graphics, and then through CPHC, they will also take the same forecast, and then they create those probabilistic graphics. The difference between J2WC graphics being Zulu date and time, and then they're working with nautical miles and knots with their speeds. They're more geared to more of a, I guess a structured type of a graphic that is geared more for DoD assets. And then we take the product as a National Weather Service here in Guam and Honolulu. We take it and more localize it, both in the miles per hour, the speeds, the location. We put everything in the local time, so it's more standard time. And so while they're the same graphics, the same data, it's a different look to the graphics. I hope that answers your question okay.
Great, thank you, Brandon.
Yes. So next, we're going to go ahead and bring up Tiare Eastmond from USAID. I will hold off on the tropical cyclone outlook for the West Pacific until after Tiare presents. So Tiare, you're going to talk about the USAID operations, and the work that you all do across the region is phenomenal, because y'all respond to all kinds of hazards and events and stuff, including Tonga earlier this year. And so I know you were busy with that. So Tiare, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. Can you see my full screen there, my full slide?
Yes.
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great. So I'm Tiare Eastmond. I'm based here in Honolulu. I sit in the FEMA office at Fort Shafter, but my job is to coordinate disaster responses across the Pacific, the North Pacific, as well as the South Pacific. In addition to coordinating disaster responses, we also work, as you saw, with some of the projects with CRS and some of the work that on the Homeowners Handbook. We are really working to better prepare ahead of the disasters and improve and make more resilient communities, governments, and even at the household level. So I'm going to share with you, I'll try to go quickly. This is our mandate globally. So USAID is a global organization. We respond to disasters, and this is our real sort of narrow focus in terms of our mandate. To give you a sense of what we do around the world, we respond to about 82 humanitarian crises each year. In the last year, and this includes very big complex emergencies such as what's happening now in Ukraine, as well as very unexpected sudden onset such as the Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai volcano tsunami eruption that we experienced at the beginning of this year. We have certain criteria that needs to be met. So, not every disaster warrants international or US government response. So we look very carefully to see what the significant unmet humanitarian needs are. So just because we could respond to a disaster does not necessarily mean we should. Most often, I think it's a good day when the host government, the local communities, the national disaster emergency managers, when they handle the disaster on their own. To me, that's the best case scenario. So I know there's lots of interest in, you know, getting the U.S. out there. What are we going to do? What could we do? But really, you know, with the kinds of disasters the Pacific is facing, the remoteness, it is a win when communities handle disasters, evacuate on their own, and have their own tools to recover from these disasters. So we do have our criteria. You can see that here, what we look for when we respond to a disaster. We can do lots of different things in response. We can send commodities, so we can send blankets, jerry cans, water containers, boat motors, plastic sheeting to make temporary shelter. We can send people, such as myself, to do assessments or coordinate with local partners on the ground. And most often what we're doing is providing funding to organizations like Catholic Relief Service or the International Organization for Migration or the Red Cross that are there locally on the ground to do a disaster response. Okay, so our most recent disasters since last most recent disasters in the Pacific, Tonga, the Hunga Tonga, Hunga Ha'apai, volcano earlier this year. We provided about $2.6 million in humanitarian assistance. That assistance is still being implemented in Tonga. The ambassador referenced the Typhoon Surge in Palau in 2021, and then we've also had reference to Typhoon Wutip in 2019 that Catholic Relief Service was doing agricultural recovery programs from. These photos, the top one is us loading food, canned food, fruit and vegetables, rice, cooking oil to the outer islands for the Typhoon Wutip response. So this also just gives you a picture of how difficult the logistics are. It's all about the boats. Who can get the boats? Where can the boats go? Are the boats in good shape? What can they bring? So really in our region, the disaster response, the transportation, especially on the ocean, is critical. The bottom photo is those things stacked on the deck of that sailboat are emergency latrines. So these are manufactured locally in Fiji through one of the projects that we supported and can be dispatched immediately to provide emergency latrines, toilets during disaster responses. Okay, so hang on, I think before I wanted to get to this, I wanted to mention really what we tracked this year. They did not rise to the level of disaster response, but what we were tracking very pretty much year round was the drought in Marshall Islands. So we had reference to, you know, drought being a problem. Marshall Islands, you know, seems to be in a perpetual state of several of their northern atolls being very, very dry. So we supported through our partner IOM in the Marshall Islands to work with the National Disaster Management Office, who had a plan to distribute reverse osmosis machines that can be utilized to provide emergency drinking water early before the drought got very, very significant. So this is a lesson learned. We start early action, early drought mitigation action, saves lives, reduces the cost of response, and, you know, ensures that that people don't get into such a dire strait that there's really negative impacts. So that was part of what was going on in the Marshall Islands this year. Even though we're in a La Nina phase, that drought still was on the radar and needed some action. And then in FSM, the 2021 inundation that we had, the teams on the ground there, IOM and CRS, supported the Yap and Chuuk national disaster or state level disaster coordinators to launch the initial disaster assessment. So they were going out, and a lot of concern for the taro patches after the inundation. So really testing the salinity levels in those taro patches to see if they were, you know, above certain thresholds, to visually observe them, So I think that, you know, some of the good news is that many of these communities are already growing very resistant varieties of taro and breadfruit and bananas. But of course, you know, I think, you know, improving that is critical to the food security going forward. Yeah, so the inundation did not result in a disaster, a national level disaster declaration, but was we were able to support through releasing some relief supplies that could be distributed by the state disaster offices. So I think this is also, you know, an example of a success that the states were able to do the assessment, distribute some of the prepositioned supplies, and leave it at that without it rising to further assistance needs. Okay, so when we don't have disasters on the map, we at USAID also work on early recovery, risk reduction, and resilience. So we call this ER4. Across the Pacific, we have about 36 projects totaling about $33.5 million in active funding. So these are often multi-year projects. These are projects that are not one-offs, that you're working with the community for months and several years to map their specific vulnerability, maybe provide small funding for communities to take action and mitigate their own risks to different hazards they may be facing. So part of that is to have preparedness stocks. So just across the FSM and Marshall Islands, I don't have, oh yes, no, I don't have, I do have Palau. Palau's at the very end, Koror here. So we have prepositioned stocks across Micronesia, and we release those in coordination with our partners on the ground to distribute in the event of a small, medium, or large-scale disaster. We also have the ability to bring in from our USAID global stocks to replenish or add to those as needed. Okay, so this is my contact information, and then the link at the bottom there will also take you to an overview of Pacific Island assistance that we released pretty recently. So thanks so much for that. I'll hand it back over to Landon.
All right, thank you very much, Tiare, for that presentation. Again, the work that you all do in the region is immense. It's much appreciated because you respond to the stuff that we report on. And so it's a multi-pronged effort between many agencies, both local within the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Palau, and the Weather Service. It's a lot of work, never ending. And so thank you for the great work. And again, if you have questions regarding this presentation and the mission of the USAID in the region, don't hesitate to add it into the chat box or send Tiare an email. And so we like to hear from you and also the discussion. So we're going to go right on to the final presentation right now. That is the Western Pacific 2022 Tropical Cyclone Outlook. This is just completed last week. This is a collaborative effort with NOAA agencies, including the WFO Guam National Weather Service office here on Guam, the Pacific Region National Weather Service headquarters, and the Climate Prediction Center, and several others, including other meteorologists and climatology experts in the region. So we're going to go right into the presentation about what are we expecting this year. And so it's not all bad news for our region. So go on to the next slide, Leanne. You'll be running the presentation for me. Just a quick overview of the Pacific region. The Pacific region of the National Weather Service is one of 6 regions within the U.S. National Weather Service, and we are WFO Guam, the one of 2 field offices in the region, and we issue forecasts for all of the islands within this location of the yellow boxy area of responsibility. So we work closely with WSO or Weather Service offices in Palau, Yap, Chuuk, Pohnpei, and Majuro, and we provide forecasts for those main islands, and then that information is then transmitted from the WSOs outward to the outermost islands. And so the next slide shows a list of 39 warning points when it comes to tropical cyclone threats of tropical storm intensity or typhoon. We issue watches and warnings for any of these 39 islands in the region. And so you can imagine if we have a system developing in the Marshall Islands and tracking westward through Micronesia, we're going to be very busy here in this office, all hands on deck for a prolonged period of time as that tropical cyclone pushes through these islands. And so Again, we issue the watches and warnings to these islands. The WSOs across Micronesia, they take that information and communicate that through whatever means possible, whether it's telephone, email, Chatty Beetle, HF radio, or other methods to get that information out to the outermost islands in this region. And again, this takes time, it takes effort. And as we mentioned earlier with the ambassador, you always have to have a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D ready to go, because your first line of communication may not work. And that happened with us in the CNMI a couple of years ago when the fiber cable was cut, severing all communications. And so we were working a typhoon in the northern CNMI islands without primary communications, no phone, no internet. And so we had to get the mission done one way or another, and we did. And so that's something else we like to take pride in this region, is how we can be so flexible across multiple agencies and difficulties in getting the job done. So the next slide, regarding those watches and warnings, this is what they're based off of: the onset of damaging winds. And so the damaging winds, those are sustained surface winds of 39 miles per hour or more, averaged over a 1 minute period. The destructive winds, those are sustained winds of 58 miles per hour or more. And so our watches and warnings for typhoons and tropical storms, they are based on the onset of damaging winds. And that's what we're going to be looking for. So keep that in mind when you hear the term watch and warning, no matter where you are. What is a watch? Well, that means a tropical storm watch means that damaging winds of 39 miles per hour or more are possible from a tropical storm or developing tropical storm, generally within 48 hours. And so that's the key word. Those winds are possible within 48 hours. A typhoon watch means that a typhoon or a developing typhoon poses a possible threat. Damaging winds are possible within 48 hours, which then, of course, could build up to typhoon intensity. When it comes to a warning, and this is where it links with Brandon's charts, he was showing the probabilities, the watch timing has a little bit of uncertainty because you're 2 days out. So those winds are possible. Once things get more refined in the timeline and expectations, the warning is issued with a 24-hour outlook. Tropical storm warning means damaging winds are expected within 24 hours or are already occurring. And for a typhoon warning, that means typhoon conditions are expected with damaging winds expected to begin within 24 hours or occurring. So keep that in mind. We're going to touch back on this in just a little bit at the end of this presentation. The next slide, showing some of the background into what goes into our thought process when making these tropical cyclone outlooks. What we expect seasonally or annually closely hinges on the ENSO cycle. Are we in a La Nina pattern? Are we in an El Nino pattern? Or are we neutral? And so the last couple of years, we've been in a weak to moderate La Nina, which has developed all of the activity generally in our area or farther west and northwest. And so during a La Nina pattern, you notice most of the tropical weather develops in that La Nina box, that blue shaded area. But when we're dealing with an El Nino, tropical activity shifts farther eastward. And so we're looking at a lot more tropical cyclones developing in the Marshall Islands, Koshrai, Pohnpei of Eastern Micronesia, and then tracking westward more into our region. I don't have previous years maps included in this presentation, but I do have those for your interest later. Think back to 2020. That was a very slow year. We had tropical storm Atsani developed just south and southwest of Guam around October 30th. We were in a tropical storm warning, I believe, for under a day as that thing tracked just southwest of Guam right before Halloween. That was the only tropical cyclone threat for that year. That was a strong La Nina year. But go back to 2015, that was a strong El Nino, and we had significant activity across the region with many tropical cyclones developing across the Eastern Micronesia, tracking through Guam and the CNMI. Tropical Storm Bobby, March 15th, Typhoon Dolphin, May 15th. Also, we had Typhoon Chanhong and a number of other storms that year, including Typhoon Silor, which made a direct hit over Saipan. So we had about 6 to 8 tropical cyclones pass through the Mariana Islands that year, just south of Anatahan. And so the next slide showing the climatology, the frequencies of tropical cyclones and the various patterns. So the image on the left showing the frequencies for La Nina seasons versus ENSO neutral seasons on the right. And so you notice that shift makes an eastward push as the climate changes. And so we don't have an El Nino chart up here available, but that activity shifts even farther eastward during an El Nino. And the next slide showing our outlook for this year, and what we're looking at is a near normal tropical cyclone outlook predicted for the remainder of 2022. And that's for Guam, the CNMI, Republic of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. So we're not looking at a robust active year. The Atlantic, unfortunately, will be seeing their 7th straight year of forecast above normal activity. But for us, we're going to be just below average, but near average. 2020 was a very slow year as far as tropical cyclones across the entire region. Last year, we had a little bit more activity based on some of the climate changes or the climate patterns last year. This year, we could probably see a little bit more activity than what we had last year based on some indications where right now we're in a La Nina pattern. That's going to hold at least through the summer months, and then it could transition toward an INSO neutral type pattern in the fall or later in the year. So we do have to watch out for that. And the next slide showing, the first slide, of course, is tropical cyclones. That's tropical storm and typhoon intensity storms. The next slide showing just typhoon force systems, those cyclones that are greater than or equal to 74-mile-per-hour winds. And again, this is just a prediction. This is not an expected number, but a prediction that we could see this many systems passing through this region later this year. And of course, we will update this possibly in August or early September if we expect major changes to this current outlook. The next slide showing just this information in a chart by region. We have, based on the climatology, have split the region up into those 8 zones as you saw in those first 2 charts. And then the named storms, there's the tropical storms and typhoon intense cyclones, and then the typhoons on the rightmost column. The next slide showing just some of the caveats with this outlook. Again, we're expecting near normal activity, and that's consistent with a possible transition from the current La Nina to a possible INSO neutral cycle by the end of the year. That could mean we get a little bit more activity across the region later this year. The outlook indicates a busier year than what was seen in 2020 and a slightly busier year than was seen in 21. And so we had, for us on Guam, we had about 4 tropical systems developing right on our doorstep, which later became stronger tropical systems in the Philippine Sea. So we could see a little bit more of that, as well as possibly more developed systems moving through the Mariana Islands. Late season activity could vary based on the status of the INSO. And so due to long range uncertainty that's ongoing right now, that's the barrier in the climate models. They don't handle long range forecasts at this time of the year, but once things come into a better alignment in the coming months, we'll have a better projection for where the climate may shift to later this year. An updated outlook may be provided in August if needed to reflect any major changes. TC activity varies considerably from east to west and from north to south, and the outlook is a general guide of the predicted overall TC activity across Micronesia. It's not a prediction of how many systems will actually make landfall. So that's important to take note. This is not a direct hit or a landfall forecast, but just a prediction of systems that may pass through a region. And so that's where these outer effects of tropical systems is key to your messaging and your preparedness. It doesn't take a direct hit to cause problems for any single island. So keep that in mind. If that black line of the forecast track doesn't pass overhead where you are, you can still feel some significant impacts. While TC activity can fluctuate greatly from year to year, TCs can and do occur anytime throughout the year in this region. And earlier this year, April, Typhoon Malakas and Palau and Yap, that's a prime example. Typhoon Surigay back in April of 2021 and Wutep in February of 2019. They can and do occur any time of the year. Residents of the Western North Pacific should always maintain weather readiness and be prepared for if and when disaster strikes. And we have a great list of panelists here today that are very much involved in those preparedness activities and response. Know where to find the most up-to-date weather forecasts and outlooks, as well as watches, warnings, and advisories at weather.gov/GUM. Also reach out to your local weather service office in Micronesia and us as well, and talk about anything preparedness, weather forecasts, and outlooks. The next slide showing just a list of the many products that will be issued. And so I see Leanne was typing in the chat window regarding a question with the forecast charts. These are all based on the JTWC, Joint Typhoon Warning Center forecast track and intensity plots. So our information is the same as theirs, but it's just presented differently. So it has a different look and feel for it. But once the Joint Typhoon Warning Center starts issuing warnings on a developing tropical cyclone or a tropical depression, they have a whole series of text bulletins that go out. From there, the National Weather Service office here on Guam, we start issuing public advisories that go out every 6 hours based on that tropical cyclone forecast. If we place any of those 39 warning point islands into a watch or warning, we start issuing local statements providing detailed information for those islands specifically under a watch and warning. We also start issuing intermediate public advisories on the 5s and 11s. So we have public advisories going out every 3 hours, local statements going out every 6 hours. And then once a tropical cyclone is within our radar range here on Guam, we issue updates on that position based off the radar data. We can track that right through our region. So when it comes to a tropical cyclone in the region, we are all hands on deck, especially when there's a watch or warning issued with all of this information going through. So you have to know where to find it and when to look for it. And so we communicate that on our webpage and also our social media. And so the next slide showing again, just a recap of the watches and warnings. Again, they are all based on the onset of damaging winds. So keep that in mind. We might have a typhoon warning in effect. That doesn't mean that the typhoon winds will start in 24 hours. It means those damaging winds will start in 24 hours. So we have to keep that in mind, especially for preparedness plans. How long is it going to take you to make sure all your assets, your family, your friends, your coworkers, your office is all prepared for the onset of damaging winds? Because once those winds start, we want people to be in shelter. We cannot evacuate. We shelter in place here on the islands. The next slide showing the webpage, this is where you find that information. Again, weather.gov/GUM. Click on the current hazards icon right there in the middle horizontal menu bar, and then you'll scroll down to tropical cyclones. That takes you to our tropical cyclones page. And that box that says no active tropical cyclones at this time, that'll be all automatically populated with a series of text bulletins and graphics on any given tropical cyclone. So that's where you're going to find the information, and we'll also parallel that information on our social media pages as well. So the next slide showing just a detail of our communication. We work closely with all of our partners, not just on Guam and the CNMI, but all of Micronesia as well, with primary communications, again, phone, email, video conferencing. We've had to go all virtual for a lot of our meetings because of the COVID pandemic, but also have secondary communications through satellite phone, chatty beetles, and then also HF radio, WhatsApp, NWS chat. We'll talk more about that in September for National Preparedness Month. I do want to talk to our 24-hour warning point offices more about NWS chat. We also have direct and frequent communications with our core partners, Guam Homeland Security, CNMI Homeland Security, the US Embassies and USAID across the region, Joint Region Marianas, and the military bases. So we can't succeed in our mission to protect life and property without these partnerships with all of our government and agency entities. And so it's a 24/7 operation, and the Weather Ready Nation's been so important for our operations, reaching out to the community, working with our partners, and building this awareness and outreach and education campaign. So thank you all to you that partner with us in the Weather Ready Nation and being a part of this and helping us get out the word, especially in regards to early warnings and preparedness. And the next slide, just some contact information if you need that. Write it down, jot it, check it out, bookmark it. That's where you can find us at any time of the year, 24/7. We are always in the office, working 24/7. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. And I think, Jenna, we will be pushing out this release, the formal media release with the Outlook. That'll be going out shortly after this webinar concludes. So if you have any questions, I will be happy to take those regarding this presentation or any of the prior presentations. Our speakers are still on the call.
All right, I don't see any questions right now, any hands raised, but if you do have a question, please use the raise hand button or the question box to ask any questions. I did have one from earlier, Dana Reynolds reaching out to Tiare to do a little behind the scenes or offline best practices between DART and FEMA IMAT programs. So Tiare and Dana, maybe you guys can link up together.
Thanks for that, Leanne. Yeah, also, again, these presentations are available in the webinar in the window, so feel free to save them, look them over. A lot of great information there. And don't hesitate to reach out to any of us that spoke today to brainstorm, to discuss things, all things related to climate and weather and sea level rise. Those are certainly big topics, and I hope there's discussion that will follow this webinar, especially within your local communities, and how to better prepare yourself for these changes in the future and how to mitigate your risk. So if there are no questions, I think we can conclude this webinar. Thank you all for coming to us, and please send me an email if you have any comments or topics that you would like to see in future webinars with this office. I want to hear them because we're always trying to reach out and speak to topics and concerns to this region that really affect people directly. So if you have any thoughts or requests for conversation or topics for discussion, please send those my way. You know where to contact me, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. All right, Leanne, I guess we can end the webinar. Thank you all for attending today's climate conference, and I look forward to seeing you next year.